humanity's ruthless counterattack, left the entire galaxy silent. The alarm did not give me time to think. It pulled me out of a dead sleep with a sound I had not heard in months, the kind of alarm that does not mean a drill. I was on my feet before my eyes fully opened, boots already on, fingers moving through the buttons of my jacket in the dark. The bunker was shaking. Not violently, not enough to knock anything off the walls, but enough to feel it in the soles of my feet. That slow, deep vibration that only means one thing when you are living under 60 meters of ice and methane on Titan. Something large had just fired, and it was not one of ours. I reached the command corridor in under a minute. The lights were red, which meant we had already moved past the warning phase and into full response mode. Around me, men and women were running, not in panic, but in that particular focused way that soldiers move when they have prepared for something so many times that the body just takes over. Lieutenant Pete Garland fell into step beside me without a word. He had been my second since before we went underground, and the look on his face told me everything the alarm had not. "They found the outer ring," he said. I did not ask which outer ring. There was only one that mattered. The command center was already full when I arrived. Colonel Diane Holt stood at the main table, her silver hair catching the red light, her eyes fixed on the display above her. The display showed Titan's upper orbital layer, and moving through it like shadows crossing a lamp were 3 Keth vessels. They were not the massive warships the Dominion had used on Mars. These were scouts. Smaller, faster, built to identify and report. They had not fired yet. They were looking. "Do they know what they are looking at?" I asked. Colonel Holt did not look away from the display. "Not yet," she said, "but they will in about 4 minutes if we do not move the surface drones back to cover pattern 7. I grabbed the nearest console and sent the order myself. The drones, the same ones that from above looked like slow agricultural machines crawling across Titan's surface, began shifting. Their movements were designed to look random to any scanner that did not already know what to look for. The Keth scanners were good. We had studied every piece of their technology that had survived the assault on our outer colonies, and we had built our deception around exactly what those scanners could and could not see. What they could not see was what we had built beneath those drones. I had been inside Project Lazarus for 19 months. I had arrived with nothing but the clothes I was wearing, and the memory of watching a feed from Ganymede Station as the Keth Dominion's fleet moved through our outer system without a single challenge from anyone in the galactic community. No warning, no protest, not one signal from any of the 34 spacefaring civilizations that made up the Galactic Covenant. They had watched. Some of them had even recorded it for their scientific archives. The slow erasure of human settlements on 3 moons and 1 full colony world, filed away as data on primitive species' response to external pressure. That memory had kept me moving through every long day in the tunnels. Lazarus was not one thing. It was 100 things hiding inside one idea. It was human engineers working in double shifts, designing engine cores that no Keth analyst would recognize because we had built them from entirely different physics than anything we had ever published. It was human welders joining hull plates inside the hollowed-out shells of cargo freighters that the Keth had already classified as unarmed. It was human mathematicians calculating jump trajectories that used Titan's gravitational shadow as a launch blind, trajectories that would not appear on any galactic navigation chart because we had never filed them. It was human stubbornness mostly. That is what people outside the bunker never quite understood. They thought we were building weapons. We were, but mostly we were building something harder to make than weapons. We were building the absolute refusal to accept that what happened to Mars was the end of the story. The Keth had given us 30 days. They had broadcasted on every open frequency, in every major galactic language, as if they expected us to thank them for the warning. 30 days to submit all military technology for permanent decommissioning, to open every human installation to Keth inspection, to formally acknowledge the Dominion's authority over what they called the contested inner zones, which was just a polished phrase for Earth and everything near it. 30 days. We had started Lazarus 19 months before that broadcast. On the display, the 3 Keth scouts were still moving. One of them slowed near Sector 9, hovering over an area where we had 3 launch bays hidden under 4 meters of Titan ice. My jaw tightened. Garland was watching the same thing. Neither of us said anything. Colonel Holt had already put 2 of our own surface systems on passive monitor, meaning they would record without transmitting, invisible to anything the scouts were using to sweep for signals. Then the scout moved on. I let out a breath so slowly that nobody noticed. "They are running a pattern sweep," Holt said, finally turning to look at me. "They come back every 41 hours. We think they are checking for heat signatures above baseline." And we are below baseline. By 7%. Garland's team adjusted the cooling arrays last week. I looked at Garland. He gave a small nod, the kind that means it was harder than I am making it sound, but I did it anyway. That was the thing about the people in Lazarus. None of them talked about how hard any of it was. They just did it and moved to the next problem. I had watched people work 20-hour stretches on systems they had never trained for, learning as they went, because there was no one else and there was no time. I had watched a 23-year-old named Cal Dover spend 11 days straight redesigning the power routing for one of our main ships after the original engineer had collapsed from exhaustion and had to be put on medical rest. Cal had no formal engineering degree. He had taught himself from archived texts and the notes the previous engineer left behind, and when he was done, the power routing was more efficient than the original design. We had a lot of people like Cal. "Where are we on readiness?" I asked. Colonel Holt moved to the side panel and pulled up the fleet summary. 7 ships. Not elegant, not beautiful by any standard a Keth designer would recognize. They were solid and heavy and built to do specific things with extreme reliability. Each one was still technically registered as a cargo hauler in Keth Dominion records. Each one had been quietly transformed from the inside out. The hulls were original. Everything else was ours. "Primary systems are at 94% across all 7, Holt said. "Weapons integration on the 3 lead ships is complete. The remaining 4 need another 48 hours on targeting calibration." "We have 30 days, I said. "The broadcast was 6 days ago. That leaves 24. "We need 7, Holt said. The number sat in the room for a moment. 7 days. Not to be ready for some distant future operation, but to launch, to move, to stop waiting and start answering. Outside in the tunnels, past the command center door, I could hear the sound of the facility at work. The low hum of machinery, the distant clang of a tool against metal, someone's voice giving a measurement to someone else. Ordinary sounds. Sounds of people who had decided, without anyone making a speech about it, that they were not going to leave the next chapter of human history blank. The scouts completed their pass and began moving away from Titan. On the display, they shrank to small moving dots and then disappeared at the edge of sensor range. Colonel Holt turned off the alert. The lights shifted back from red to the dull amber of standard operations. Around the room, people went back to their stations, back to their work, without ceremony. Garland looked at me. 41 hours until they come back, he said. Then we have 40 hours, I said. Let's use them. I walked back out into the corridor, back toward the noise and the work and the hum of something being built that was not finished yet. I did not feel brave. I did not feel certain. But I felt the thing that had carried me through 19 months underground, the thing that every person in this facility carried whether they knew it or not. The Keth gave us 30 days, because they believed 30 days was more than enough time for us to give up. They had not done their research. Pete Garland caught up with me at the junction between the main tunnel and the lower bay. Holding a tablet with the updated readiness breakdown, I took it without stopping. We walked and talked, the way we had learned to do everything in Lazarus because standing still felt like waste. The numbers were better than I expected. Cal Dover's power routing revision had given us a 12% improvement in sustained output on the 2 ships he had worked on. A woman named Helen Marsh, who had spent the last 8 months on weapons integration, had found a way to reduce the targeting delay on our primary systems by nearly a full second. In a space engagement, a second is the distance between a strike and a miss. Helen had given us that second from nothing, working with components that had been designed for something else entirely and adapted by hand. I handed the tablet back to Garland. Tell Helen I want to see the final test data before end of cycle. She already sent it, he said. It is in your queue. She sent it at 3 this morning. That was Helen. She never waited to be asked twice for anything. The lower bay was the largest open space in the entire Lazarus complex. It had been cut from the rock over 14 months, expanded twice as our designs grew more ambitious, and now it held the two largest ships in our fleet side by side with barely 12 meters between them. Standing at the upper walkway and looking down, they did not look like warships. They looked like something compressed, like something that had been squeezed down into the smallest possible shape without losing any of its mass. There was nothing decorative about them. Every surface was functional. Every angle existed because the engineering required it. I had named them quietly in my own head, the way people name things they spend too much time staring at. The one on the left I called patience. The one on the right I called conviction. We had an official designation system that used numbers and letter codes. Nobody used it. Every ship had a name that the crew had given it, and those names had nothing to do with the official list. I walked down to the main floor of the bay. A crew of 14 was running final checks on patience, moving along its exterior with scanners and reference tablets, checking seals, checking joints, checking every point where two systems met and had to agree with each other. I stopped beside a young man named Oliver Grant who was crouched near the base of the primary thruster housing, running a calibration loop for the 4th time. "Problem?" I asked. He looked up. "No problem," he said. "I just want to be sure." "How many times have you run that loop?" "This is the 4th. "And the first 3? "Clean," he said. "All 3 clean." I looked at him for a moment. He was 26, maybe 27. He had been a commercial ship technician before the Keth cut off the outer transit routes and left about 40,000 workers stranded without income or purpose. He had come to Titan on a refugee transport and had found his way to Lazarus through a chain of introductions that began with a former colleague and ended with Colonel Holt's screening team. He had no military background. What he had was the kind of precision that comes from years of caring about small things, because small things on a ship in space can become very large things very fast. "Run it a 5th time if you need to," I said. He nodded and went back to his tablet. I continued through the bay. Around me, the facility was doing what it had done every single day for 19 months. It was working. Not dramatically, not with speeches or ceremony, but with the steady, relentless movement of people who had decided that work was the only answer to an impossible problem. I found Colonel Holt near the back of the bay, standing at a secondary console with Captain Leon Price, who commanded our 3 fastest ships. Leon was a former cargo runner who had been in the outer system when the Keth began their advance, and he had spent 3 months moving refugees before his ship was impounded at a Keth checkpoint. He had walked away from that checkpoint with nothing but a personal locator, had made his way across 3 transit hubs, and had reached Titan in a condition that the medical team described as significant but not permanent. Within a week of arriving at Lazarus, he had been running flight simulations. Within a month, he had been placed in command of the scout units. Leon did not waste words. He looked at me as I approached and said, "Jump calibration is done on all 3. We can hold a 17-point emergence pattern with a window of plus or minus 40 seconds. 40 seconds of variance across 17 simultaneous emergence points was extraordinary. It meant that when we moved, we would appear in 17 locations at almost the same instant, faster than any coordination signal the Keth could send between their ships." "Plus or minus 40 seconds is acceptable," I said. Leon almost smiled. "I know, I just wanted to hear you say it." Colonel Holt looked at both of us and then back at the display she had been working on. "I have been running projections on the blockade formation," she said. "The Keth have 8 vessels in Earth orbit and 6 in the transit zone between Earth and the Moon. Their patrol pattern repeats every 6 hours. There is a 19-minute window during each cycle where the overlap between the two groups is at its lowest." 19 minutes, I said. "That is the window," she confirmed. "If we emerge inside that window, we catch both groups at minimum mutual support range." I looked at the display. The blockade had been in place for 3 months. The Keth had settled into it with the comfort of certainty, the way any force settles in when it does not believe the other side is capable of response. Their patrol pattern was efficient, optimized, predictable. It had been predictable for 3 months because for 3 months there had been nothing to be unpredictable about. We were about to change that. "What is the next window?" I asked. Holt checked her calculations. 6 days, 14 hours from now. That accounts for transit time from Titan to the emergence points. 6 days and 14 hours. We had 7 days of work left on targeting calibration. The math was tight, but it was not impossible. "We moved to 7 days ahead of window," I said. "That gives us approximately 18 hours of margin after the last calibration check." Holt nodded. She did not look worried. She had stopped looking worried somewhere around month 9, and I did not think it was because things had gotten easier. I thought it was because she had decided that worry was a resource she could not afford to spend. I walked back through the bay toward the upper level. As I passed Oliver Grant, he was on his 5th calibration loop. The display on his tablet showed clean. He looked up at me, saw that I noticed, and gave a small nod. He was going to run a 6th. Good. The next 6 days were the quietest and the loudest days of the entire 19 months. Quiet because we had stopped building new things and were now only finishing them, which has a different kind of silence to it, the silence of completion rather than creation. Loud because the pace of that finishing was unlike anything we had sustained before. Crews worked in full rotations without reduction. The facility burned through its food stores at nearly twice the normal rate, because people were not stopping to eat at regular times. They were grabbing what they could between tasks. I slept 4 hours a night and called it enough. On the 5th day, Helen Marsh came to find me in the corridor near the navigation section. She was carrying a printed sheet, which was unusual because Helen never printed anything. She handed it to me without comment. It was the final targeting test results for all 7 ships. Every system had passed. Not barely passed, not passed with noted concerns. Passed cleanly, completely, with margins that were better than our design specifications in 4 out of 7 cases. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. "Thank you, Helen," I said. She shrugged, which was her version of "you are welcome," and walked back the way she had come. On the 6th day, we held a final readiness review. All 7 ship commanders were present, either in person or on SecureLink. Leon Price was there with his 3 captains. The 4 other commanders, a woman named Claire Dunstan who ran our heaviest vessel, a quiet man named Warren Cole on our 2nd largest ship, and 2 others I had come to trust completely over 19 months of working in impossible conditions, all confirmed readiness without exception. Colonel Holt ran through the operation sequence one final time. Emergence points, timing, initial engagement priorities, communication protocols, contingency branches if any of the 7 ships encountered problems during transit. Everyone listened. Nobody asked questions that were not necessary. We had been over the plan so many times that the asking of unnecessary questions would have felt strange. When Holt finished, I looked around the room. "The Keth gave us 30 days, I said. "They gave us 30 days because they believed we were finished. They looked at what happened to our outer colonies and they decided that what they saw was the final version of us. They were wrong." I paused. "We move in 18 hours. There was no cheer, no noise at all. Just the quiet, steady look of people who had decided something a long time ago and were now simply arriving at the moment when that decision would mean something. I dismissed the review. Garland walked out with me. The corridor was busy with final preparations, people moving with purpose, carrying equipment, running last checks on systems that had already been checked and checked again. "How are you feeling?" Garland asked. It was the first time in 6 days anyone had asked me that. "Ready," I said. It was not the most complete answer I had ever given, but it was the true one. We launched in the early hours of Titan's mechanical night cycle, when the facility's ambient noise was at its lowest, and the Keth scouts were at the far end of their patrol arc. 7 ships rose through the ice layer through the exit shafts that had been cut for exactly this moment, and had been sealed and cooled to match the surrounding surface temperature whenever the scouts were near. They rose slowly, without active engines, riding the launch rail systems that accelerated them to minimum safe distance before the drives engaged. There was no dramatic moment of activation, no single instant where everything changed. The ships just moved, one after another, out into the dark above Titan, and then the drives came online and we began the journey toward the positions from which we would emerge. I was on patience. I stood at the forward observation post, which was a modest room with a narrow viewport and a tactical display, and I watched Titan shrink behind us. 19 months underground. 19 months of ice walls and artificial light, and the sound of machinery, and the smell of recycled air, and the absolute certainty that what we were doing was the only thing worth doing. I pressed one hand briefly against the viewport glass, cold under my palm. Then I turned back to the tactical display, where 7 green indicators moved together through Titan's orbital dark, and I went to work. We arrived at our emergence points with 12 minutes to spare before the window. Leon Price's 3 ships were already in position, their drives at minimum output, waiting with the patience of people who had learned that waiting and wasting were not the same thing. The 4 heavier ships, including Patience, settled into their designated coordinates with a precision that would have been impossible 6 months ago and was now simply expected. I watched the timer on the tactical display count down. Around me, the crew of Patience moved through their final checks in near silence. The only voices were confirmations, short and specific, the language of people who have reduced everything to what matters. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. Colonel Holt's voice came through on the command channel from her position on conviction, steady as always. "All units confirm ready." One by one, the confirmations came in, 7 green lights on the board. 1 minute. I thought about Mars, not the abstract idea of it, not the political significance or the historical weight. I thought about the specific images I had seen on the feeds before we went underground. The atmospheric domes cracked open, the settlements left open to the thin, cold air, the silence of places that had been full of people. I thought about the 34 species of the Galactic Covenant who had watched that happen and had said nothing. The timer reached 0. 17 points of emergence lit up across the display as our ships crossed into the inner system simultaneously, and the Keth blockade had 4 minutes to understand what was coming before we reached engagement range. They used all 4 minutes trying to send a warning to the Galactic Covenant. Nobody came. We had known nobody would come. That was the point. The engagement lasted 38 minutes. The Keth vessels were fast and their shielding systems were sophisticated and their crews were experienced. None of that was the issue. The issue was that they had been trained, as all Galactic Covenant-adjacent forces had been trained, to fight by the established protocols of interstellar engagement. Warning shots first. Shield exchange to establish relative power. A pause for the losing side to assess and signal surrender intent. Then, if surrender was not signaled, escalation to the next level. They fired their warning shots. We did not pause. They initiated the shield exchange sequence, broadcasting the standard Dominion codes that meant we are ready to assess mutual capability. We did not respond to the codes. The Keth admiral commanding the blockade, whose name I later learned was something that translated roughly as one who ensures stability, opened a direct communication channel at the 11-minute mark. The channel light blinked on my display 14 times. I watched it blink. I did not answer it. Not because I was being cruel, not because I had forgotten what communication meant, but because answering it would have meant accepting the framework in which the Keth operated, the framework in which there was a standard procedure and a recognized escalation ladder, and a mutually understood set of signals that meant this conflict exists within boundaries we both accept. We did not accept those boundaries. Mars had not been given boundaries. Our colonies had not been given a channel to open. Our people had not been given a 14-blink warning. At the 38th minute, the last Keth vessel in the Earth-Moon transit zone was neutralized, not eliminated entirely. Disabled, its drive systems and weapons inoperative, its crew spaces intact. We had been specific about that. We had been specific about a great many things. I looked at the tactical display. Earth orbit was clear. The Moon's approach lanes were clear. The sensor network that the Keth had established over 3 months to watch our homeworld's every movement was dark. I opened the shipwide channel. "This is Commander Alara Voss," I said. "The Earth-Moon system is clear. All units confirm status and hold position." The confirmations came in. 6 green lights, and one that took an extra 40 seconds because Warren Cole's ship had taken damage to one of its secondary arrays, and his crew was already working on it. Then 7 green lights. Garland was at the secondary console to my left. He did not say anything. Neither did anyone else in the room. There was nothing to say that the green lights had not already said. I looked at the viewport. Earth was visible now, a blue point at this distance, small enough to hold between 2 fingers but there, present, unblocked. We had not celebrated. We did not celebrate now. There were still 6 days of work ahead of us, because this had never been about clearing the blockade alone. This had always been about what came next. I pulled up the jump calculations for our next destination. The Keth Dominion had a home system. It had a capital world. It had a council that had made the decisions which led to Mars and to our outer colonies, and to 34 species watching in comfortable silence. We had prepared coordinates for all of it. I authorized the jump sequence. "All units," I said into the command channel, "we moved to Phase 2. We came out of transit above Ketha Prime at the 4th hour of our operational clock. The planet filled the forward viewport the way Earth had looked from a certain distance, large and present and real in a way that tactical displays never quite captured. It was blue-green with a different palette than Earth, more gray in the water, more orange in the land masses near the poles, but alive, populated. The capital of an empire that stretched across 19 star systems and had never, in its recorded history, faced a counterattack from a species it had decided to remove. I stood at the forward observation post on Patience and looked at it for exactly 10 seconds. Then I turned back to the display. "Confirm formation," I said. Leon Price's voice came through immediately. 3 fast units in outer arc confirmed. Claire Dunstan followed. Heavy Unit 1 in primary approach lane confirmed. Warren Cole, whose crew had repaired the secondary array during transit, came in a half-second later. Heavy Unit 2 at secondary lane confirmed. The other 2 commanders confirmed in sequence. 7 ships, 7 green indicators, everyone exactly where we had planned they would be. Months before this moment existed as anything other than a line in a projection document. The Keth Defense Network above Ketha Prime had detected us. I knew this because the first thing the network did when it detected a threat was begin broadcasting a military coordination signal, and our systems picked up that signal in the first 40 seconds after emergence. The defense network was impressive by the standards of what the Keth had needed it to be before today. It had orbital platforms, automated response systems, 3 active patrol vessels that had been in the middle of routine operations when we arrived. but it had been designed for the threats the Keth had faced historically. Disputes with neighboring systems, the occasional resource conflict with a mid-tier civilization, the kind of friction that happens between spacefaring species who have not yet agreed on where their respective territories end. It had not been designed for us. I opened the broadband channel, the one that reached every receiver in the Ketha Prime system, and also, because broadband signals do not stop at system boundaries, would be detectable by long-range sensors across a significant volume of surrounding space. I spoke clearly and without rushing. This is Commander Ilara Voss of the Human Fleet, Sol System. This action is a direct response to the Keth Dominion's assault on human settlements at Mars, Callisto, and the outer colonies designated in accord with Earth calendar dates 19 months ago. This is not a declaration of war. It is a consequence. We are targeting military infrastructure only. Civilian areas are not our objective. All civilian emergency frequencies will remain open and unblocked for the duration of this operation. I paused. This broadcast is being made in 47 languages for the benefit of any party currently monitoring this system. The duration of this operation is 72 hours. At the end of 72 hours, we will withdraw. What happens in those 72 hours is a direct reflection of what happened at Mars. I closed the channel. Garland looked at me from the secondary console. He did not say anything. I had told him what I was going to say before we jumped, so the words were not new to him. But hearing them out loud in the actual moment had a different quality than discussing them in planning. We moved. The 3 orbital platforms were the first priority. They were automated, which meant there were no crew aboard them, which was exactly why we had designated them first. We took them down with precision, not speed, moving through each one in a sequence that gave the Keth Defense Network every opportunity to observe exactly what we were targeting and what we were not. We wanted them to see the pattern. We wanted them to understand that the pattern was intentional. The 3 patrol vessels responded. Their commanders were professionals, and they did exactly what trained military commanders do when their installation is under assault. They moved to engage. We neutralized their drive and weapon systems without breaching their crew compartments and left them in stable orbit, functional in every way except their ability to fight or flee. It took 4 hours and 11 minutes to clear the military orbital layer. At the 5-hour mark, the Keth Dominion's High Council made contact. The signal was directed at our fleet on a military command frequency, addressed to whoever is in command of the unidentified vessels. I found that phrasing interesting. They knew exactly who we were. They had heard the broadcast, but addressing us formally would have meant acknowledging that we were what we clearly were, and the Council was not ready to do that yet. The Council speaker, through the translation matrix our linguists had built over 19 months from every piece of Keth communication we had ever intercepted, offered what was technically a conditional cessation agreement. They used careful language, not surrender, not acknowledgement of wrongdoing. A conditional cessation, meaning they were willing to discuss pausing hostilities if we were willing to discuss our terms. Colonel Holt, on the channel with me, said nothing. She was letting me decide. I thought about Mars for the second time. I activated the response channel. This is Commander Voss. We are not in a hostilities framework. This is a consequence being delivered. We are not pausing it and we are not negotiating its terms. The terms were set when the first dome on Mars was broken open. We are delivering them now. If you want to speak to us, we will be here for another 67 hours. We will listen to anything you want to say. We will not stop. I closed the channel. There was a long silence from the Keth side. The silence lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes, during which we continued working through the list of military installations in the inner orbital zone. Every one of them targeted with the same care, the same precision, the same absolute avoidance of anything that was not a military system. I noticed something during those 2 hours. The 17 species who had long-range sensors pointed at Ketha Prime, the ones whose observation was almost certain given the system's political significance, would be seeing exactly what we had designed them to see. Not chaos, not rage, method, purpose. A force that knew exactly what it was doing, and was doing it with a discipline that left no room for the narrative that the Keth would later try to use. The one about human unpredictability, about primitive aggression, about species that could not be reasoned with. We were the most reasonable force that had ever sat above Ketha Prime. We were just not stopping. At the 19-hour mark, 3 Galactic Covenant vessels from the nearest member system began accelerating toward Ketha Prime. Their transit time at maximum speed was 10 days and 16 hours. I noted this on the planning display and added nothing to it. There was nothing to add. We had 11 days before they could arrive. We needed 3. Leon Price sent me a short message through the internal channel. It said, "They are coming." My response said, "I know." His next message said, 11 days. My response said, "We need 3." His final message said, "Then we have 8 to spare." I did not respond to that one, but I kept the message on my secondary display for the rest of the operation. At the 31st hour, something happened that was not in any of our planning documents. A civilian broadcast from inside Ketha Prime's largest population center reached our receiver array. It was not from the government. It was not from the military. It was from what our translation matrix identified as a community information channel, the Keth equivalent of a local broadcast. The speaker was asking where the Keth Council was, why the emergency shelters had not been activated for civilian areas, and why, if the attacking force had said it was not targeting civilians, the government had not simply told people they were safe to stay where they were. I listened to the whole broadcast. It was 40 seconds long. Then I turned to our communications officer, a woman named Dorothy Shaw, who had spent 3 months building the translation capability we were now depending on. "Open the civilian emergency channel," I said. Dorothy looked at me, not in surprise, but in the way people look when they are confirming they heard something correctly. "The civilian emergency frequency, to broadcast to them." "To broadcast to them," I confirmed. She opened the channel. I spoke in the Keth language, through the translation matrix, knowing it would not be perfect but trusting Dorothy's work enough to believe it would be understood. "Civilian residents of Ketha Prime. This is Commander Alara Voss of the human fleet. We have broadcast our intentions and we are conducting this operation exactly as stated. We are not targeting residential areas, civilian infrastructure, food systems, medical facilities, or emergency services. You do not need to evacuate. Your emergency systems are functioning and will continue to function. We have no interest in harming you. Our business is with the military apparatus of the Dominion that ordered the assault on human settlements. Stay where you are. You are safe." I closed the channel. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was not in the plan." "No," I agreed. "Was it the right thing?" I thought about the 19-month-old asking a reasonable question on a community broadcast while her government hid in its emergency chambers. "Yes," I said. At the 72nd hour precisely, I opened the broadband channel again. "This is Commander Voss. 72 hours have elapsed. The human fleet is withdrawing from the Ketha Prime system. All disabled vessels and platforms have been left in stable, non-hazardous positions. All civilian systems are intact. This operation is complete." I paused. The Galactic Covenant vessels that have been in transit toward this system for the past 2 days are welcome to conduct any assessment they choose. They will find exactly what we said they would find. I closed the channel. We jumped. Dorothy Shaw was watching me from across the communication station when I closed that civilian channel. She had the expression of someone who had just seen something that was not in any planned document, and she was right. It was not. Nothing in our 19 months of preparation had included a message of reassurance to the people living under the government. we were holding accountable. But 19 months of preparation had also not included being the kind of force we had accused the Keth of being. A force that moved against people without distinguishing between the ones who made decisions and the ones who simply lived inside those decisions. I had made a distinction. I intended to keep making it. Warren Cole's voice came through the command channel at the 22nd hour. Warren was not a man who used the command channel unless he had something worth saying, so I answered immediately. He had been observing the sensor patterns around Ketha Prime's secondary orbital zone and had noticed something that was not on our target list but was worth flagging. 3 of the Keth's civilian research platforms were in a vulnerable position relative to our operational corridor. They were not military. They were not armed. They were staffed by researchers who, according to the identification codes the platforms were broadcasting, included scientists from 4 non-Keth species who were there on exchange programs. Warren wanted to know if we should adjust our corridor to give the platforms more clearance. I told him yes, adjust it by 300 kilometers and log the adjustment with the reason. He logged it. The reason went into our operational record, which we knew would eventually be reviewed by the Covenant. I had wanted everything in the record, every decision, every adjustment, every moment where we could have done more damage than we did and chose not to. I wanted the record to be so complete that there was no space in it for interpretation. We had done what we said we would do. We had not done what we had not said we would do. Those were the 2 most important facts of the entire operation, and I needed them documented in a way that nobody could ever honestly challenge. At the 48th hour, the Keth Dominion's High Council tried a different approach. Instead of contacting us directly, they sent a message through the Galactic Covenant's emergency relay, formally requesting that the Covenant intervene and halt our operation on the grounds that it constituted an unprovoked attack on a Covenant-adjacent civilization. I read the message twice. Then I had Dorothy pull up the Covenant's own records of the Keth Dominion's operations against human settlements, the ones that had been logged under the bureaucratic category of stability actions. I compared the date of the Keth's first stability action against our outer colonies with the date of the first emergency relay message any human government had sent to the Covenant asking for acknowledgement of the situation. Our first message had been sent 7 months before the Keth began their advance. The Covenant had logged it as received and filed it under preliminary assessment, which was the category used for situations that did not yet require active response. They had never moved it out of that category. I included that comparison in a formal response to the Covenant's relay and sent it back through the same channel. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply placed the timeline in the record next to the Keth's complaint and let the dates speak for themselves. Then I went back to the operational display and continued the work. Claire Dunstan sent me a short message at the 58th hour. It said, 2 of the disabled Keth patrol vessels are drifting slightly off their stable orbit positions. Do we correct them or let Covenant handle it when they arrive? I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and then sent back, we correct them. She sent back a single word, understood, and 20 minutes later the 2 vessels had been nudged back into stable positions by a precision thruster pulse from one of Leon's fast units. We fixed the orbits of the ships we had disabled. I think about that a lot, even now. Not because it was a grand gesture, not because I expected anyone to notice or to give us credit for it. I think about it because it was the specific detail that made everything else legible. You can say many things about your intentions. You can broadcast them in 47 languages and put them in the operational record and document every decision in precise detail. But the moment where you spend fuel and time correcting the drift of a disabled enemy vessel so that its crew does not face additional danger, that moment is the one that cannot be argued with. It simply is what it is. At exactly the 72nd hour, I opened the broadband channel. I had written nothing down. I had thought about what I was going to say since the 50-hour mark, turning it over, removing things that were unnecessary, keeping only what was honest. I said what I said, and then we jumped. and the galaxy went silent. Not immediately, not all at once, but in the hours and days that followed, as the reports from the 17 observing species spread through the Covenant network, as the sensor records were analyzed and the operational logs were reviewed, and the sheer documented precision of what we had done sank into the political consciousness of every government that had been watching. A particular kind of silence settled across the communications channels that humans monitored. It was the silence of recalculation. I had heard that silence before, in smaller ways, in the moments after someone realizes that their model of a situation was wrong and they need to start over. This was that silence at a scale I had no previous frame for. 34 civilizations, hundreds of years of established galactic political norms, an entire framework built on the assumption that human beings were a primitive species at an early stage of development that could be managed and directed, and when necessary, reduced without significant consequence. That assumption had just been stress-tested. It had not survived the test. We were on our way to Verath 7 when the first intelligence report came in about the 6 civilizations beginning to quietly review their expansion plans. Garland read it to me from the secondary console while I was going over the operational records one final time before the Covenant session. I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "Who is the first one on the list?" Garland checked. The HFY Federation. They had 3 planned transit routes through the belt sector adjacent to our outer system. All 3 have been flagged for internal review. The HFY Federation had been one of the species that recorded the Keth's advance on our outer colonies. They had published the recording in a scientific journal 4 months later, under a title that translated roughly as Behavioral Analysis of Primitive Resistance Response. I found a deep satisfaction in that particular name being first on Garland's list. "Keep monitoring," I said. "Log every adjustment you see." "All of them." "All of them," I said. "I want a complete picture." The complete picture, by the time we reached Verath 7, included 6 civilizations and 14 discrete adjustments to expansion and transit plans that had previously pointed toward human-adjacent space. None of them had announced these adjustments. None of them had attributed them to the events of the preceding weeks. They were simply internal reviews that happened to be happening now. The galaxy was not silent because we had frightened it into paralysis. It was silent because it was thinking. And a galaxy that was thinking about us very carefully was a very different thing from a galaxy that had decided we were not worth thinking about at all. I walked into the Covenant session carrying everything that had been built and decided and corrected and documented over 19 months of underground work, over 7 days of operational execution, over 72 hours of precisely measured consequence. And I placed one data chip on the table and asked one question, and waited for the silence that I already knew was coming. The Galactic Covenant emergency session was held at Verath 7, a neutral station in the deep transit zone between 4 major member systems, 11 days after we withdrew from Ketha Prime. I arrived alone. This was a deliberate choice. I had discussed it with Colonel Holt and with the 7 ship commanders, and with a small group of people whose judgment I had come to trust over 19 months of working in impossible conditions, and every one of them agreed. Sending a delegation, sending lawyers, sending diplomats with carefully prepared documents, all of that would have communicated something about where we thought we stood relative to this room. I did not want to communicate that. I wanted to communicate something else. I walked into the session chamber with a standard-issue fleet jacket, a data chip in my pocket, and no notes. The chamber was designed to accommodate the physical requirements of 34 different species, which meant it was large, varied in temperature zone by zone, lit at different spectrums in different sections, and arranged so that no single species had an obvious positional advantage over any other. The designers of the room had done careful work. I appreciated it abstractly while I crossed to the human-appropriate section, which had not existed in this room before today, and which had been added in the 12 hours between my request for a seat and my arrival. They had added it. That told me something. I sat. Around me, in their respective zones, the representatives of 34 spacefaring civilizations arranged themselves. Some of them I recognized from briefing files. Others were new to me. The eldest delegation in the room belonged to the Vorath Collective, who had been traveling between stars since before humans had invented the wheel, and whose representative sat at the far end of the chamber in a section where the light was a deep amber color that my eyes found it difficult to look at directly. The session coordinator, a species called the Marath whose representative function in galactic governance was something close to a neutral chairperson, opened the proceedings in the standard galactic trade language, which my earpiece translated into a clear, flat voice in English. The coordinator said that the session had been called to address the events of the preceding 14 days, specifically the military actions taken by the human fleet against Keth Dominion assets, and to determine the Covenant's position in response. The first representative to speak demanded that the human fleet be placed under immediate Covenant sanction, its ships impounded, its commanders remanded to a Covenant review tribunal. I listened. A second representative said that the events at Ketha Prime represented a dangerous precedent, that any species which took unilateral military action against another Covenant-adjacent civilization, without prior Covenant authorization, threatened the stability of the framework that kept 700 years of relative peace intact. I listened. A third said that the precision of the human operation, while acknowledged, did not change the fundamental illegality of the act, and that making exceptions for precision would invite every future aggressor to simply claim that their aggression was also precise. I listened to all of them. I did not interrupt. I did not signal impatience. I had a data chip in my pocket and I had one question, and I was waiting for the right moment to use both. The right moment came when the Keth Dominion's representative, speaking for the first time, said that the Dominion had been conducting a legitimate stability operation in the outer system, and that the human response was a disproportionate aggression against a lawful exercise of Dominion authority. I placed the data chip on the table in front of me. I did not hold it up or explain it. I just placed it flat on the surface where the session cameras could see it. The room did not go quiet, but the tone changed slightly, the way a room changes when something unexpected enters it. I spoke. That data chip contains 19 months of recordings, communications intercepts, sensor logs, and open-channel broadcasts. It documents the Keth Dominion's operations against human settlements, beginning 14 months before their public announcement of the stability operation. I paused. It also contains recordings of every distress signal we transmitted on open frequencies during those operations. Frequencies that all 34 member delegations in this room have the technical capability to monitor. I let that sit. I have one question for this session. I am not asking it rhetorically. I am asking it as a genuine inquiry because the answer will determine a great deal about what humans believe about this body going forward. I looked at the room, not at any single delegation, but at all of them. Which delegation here transmitted a warning to Earth before the Keth began their operations against our settlements? The silence that followed was the most expensive silence I had ever sat inside. It was not a comfortable silence. It was not the silence of people considering their answer. It was the silence of 34 delegations understanding simultaneously that there was no answer because no warning had been sent, and that the absence of a warning was now the center of the entire conversation. No one spoke for 41 seconds. I counted them. The Vorath Collective's representative broke the silence. Not loudly, not dramatically. The Vorath did not do things dramatically. They spoke in their own language, which the translation system rendered as a slow, measured voice with very little inflection. They said, "The human commander's question does not have an answer that reflects well on this body." The session coordinator asked if the Vorath delegation was making a formal statement. The Vorath representative said, "We are making an observation. The session can classify it as it chooses. I picked up the data chip from the table and held it for a moment. Then I placed it back down, this time in the center of the table rather than just in front of my section. "The chip is for the record," I said, "not for my argument. My argument is already in the room. It arrived the moment I walked in alone and sat down." I did not elaborate on that. I did not need to. The room understood what I meant, that I had come alone because I was not here to beg, not here to negotiate from weakness, not here as a supplicant asking for recognition. I was here because we had done what we had done, and we had done it exactly as we said we would, and we had withdrawn exactly when we said we would. And the galaxy was sitting in a room trying to figure out what to do about a species that had just demonstrated something the Covenant framework had not encountered before. Not aggression without purpose, not destruction without discipline, something more unsettling than either of those, which was force with perfect self-control. The session continued for 6 more hours. I answered questions directly when they were direct. I declined to speculate when the questions were designed to get me to say something that could be classified later as a threat. I provided the data chip's contents to the formal record without restriction. I said, when asked what humanity wanted from the Covenant going forward, that we wanted what we had always wanted, to exist without our settlements being treated as inconveniences that more powerful species could remove without consequence. "We are not asking for protection," I said. "We are demonstrating that we do not need it. What we are asking for is acknowledgement that we are here, that we have always been here, and that the next species that decides we are too primitive to deserve warning before someone moves against us should look at the last 14 days very carefully before making that decision." At the end of the session, the vote was called. 34 delegations. The question was whether to formally recognize Earth as a full Covenant member civilization, with all associated rights of consultation, representation, and territorial acknowledgement. The result was 34 in favor, 0 opposed. It was the fastest unanimous vote in the recorded history of the Galactic Covenant. I did not celebrate. I thanked the session coordinator and walked out of the chamber, through the station's main corridor, and to the docking bay where our transit vessel was waiting. Garland was there. He had waited outside the station for the entire 7 hours because there had only been one seat offered to humanity, and it was mine. He looked at me as I approached. He did not ask how it went. The answer was already in my face. 34-0, I said. He nodded slowly. "Fastest in their history," I said. He said, "Fear is a remarkable thing." "Yes," I said, "it is." We boarded the transit vessel, and I sat in the forward seat and looked at the station growing smaller through the viewport. Somewhere in there, 34 delegations were filing their records and composing their reports and beginning the long process of adjusting their political calculations to account for a variable that had not existed in any of their models until 14 days ago. And somewhere, 6 other species' military strategists were already quietly reviewing their expansion plans that touched human-adjacent space. I knew this because our intelligence team had flagged the first signs of that review before I had even boarded the ship to Verath 7. No announcements, no treaties, just a quiet reorientation, the kind that happens when a calculated risk is suddenly recalculated. We had not asked for any of that. We had not threatened anyone beyond the Keth Dominion. We had simply done what we said we would do, exactly as we said we would do it, and stopped precisely when we said we would stop. That precision, apparently, was the most frightening thing the galaxy had ever seen. I understood why. Rage was familiar. Rage was something every species with enough resources eventually encountered and learned to manage. Rage escalated and then exhausted itself and eventually became negotiable. What we had shown was something different. We had shown that we could measure a consequence, deliver it without excess, and walk away without needing acknowledgement that we had won. That was not rage. That was something the Covenant did not have a classification for yet. Garland brought me a container of water and sat in the seat beside me. We flew in silence for a while. "What happens now?" he asked eventually. "We rebuild Mars," I said. And then we see what the galaxy does with what it learned." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you think they learned the right thing?" I thought about the Voreth representative, who had watched humans begin traveling between stars from a civilization that was already ancient, and who had said, quietly, in a room full of galactic power, that our question had no answer that reflected well on the Covenant. "I think some of them did," I said. The vote was announced at the end of the 7th hour of the session. I had spent those 7 hours in a chair that was designed for a species with a different skeletal structure, which meant I had spent 7 hours being quietly uncomfortable in a way that I chose not to mention, because mentioning it would have been a distraction from every other thing that mattered more. 34-0. The session coordinator read the result in the standard galactic trade language, and the translation in my earpiece rendered it in flat English, and I received it the way I had learned to receive most important things over the previous 19 months, by acknowledging it internally without visible reaction and immediately thinking about what it required next. What it required next was not celebration. It required presence. I stayed in the chamber for the formal closing procedures, which took another 40 minutes and involved a great deal of documentation and cross-referencing between the various delegation record-keeping systems. I answered 2 follow-up questions from the session coordinator about technical details of the operational record I had submitted. I confirmed that the human fleet intended to honor the withdrawal timeline we had stated in our final broadcast, which we had already honored, which I said with the patience of someone explaining something that should not need explaining. The Keth Dominion's representative did not speak to me directly during the closing procedures. This was fine. I had not come to Varath 7 to speak to the Keth Dominion's representative. I had come to make a record and ask a question and sit in an uncomfortable chair for 7 hours, while 34 civilizations processed the fact that their calculation about humanity had been incorrect. The Voreth Collective's representative found me in the corridor outside the chamber as the session was dispersing. This was unusual. The Voreth rarely initiated individual contact. They operated in collective decisions and collective communications, and the idea of one of their representatives approaching a single individual for a private conversation was notable enough that Garland, walking 3 steps behind me, moved slightly closer in the automatic response of someone who is not sure if this is a threat. It was not a threat. The Voreth representative stopped at a polite distance and addressed me in the trade language, which my earpiece translated with the same slow, measured quality that all Voreth communication seemed to carry regardless of the topic. "You have watched many species begin to travel between stars," the representative said. "We watched your species do it. We watched the Keth Dominion do it. We have watched 31 of the species in that room do it." A pause. "In our experience, the transition from early-stage expansion to mature spacefaring civilization has certain common qualities. One of those qualities, nearly universal, is a period of uncontrolled response to perceived threat, a period where the force applied exceeds the minimum required, where the anger shapes the action, rather than the action being shaped by the need." I waited. I had learned in 19 months that waiting was often more productive than speaking. "You did not have that period," the Voreth representative said. "You had the anger. We could observe the anger in everything you did, but the anger did not determine the scale of the action. You determined the scale and then you delivered it and then you stopped." Another pause. "That is not common. We have not seen it before at this stage of development." "What have you seen before?" I asked. "We have seen species destroy what hurt them," the representative said. "We have seen species endure what hurt them. We have seen species flee what hurt them. We have not seen a species measure what hurt them and deliver that exact measurement back with the excess carefully removed." I thought about Oliver Grant running his 5th calibration check, about Helen Marsh finding a spare second in a targeting delay, About Cal Dover rebuilding a power routing system from notes in 11 days. About Dorothy Shaw building a translation matrix from intercepted signals. About Colonel Holt calculating a 19-minute window in a 6-hour patrol cycle. About 100 other people in 100 other moments doing the specific thing that the specific moment required. No more and no less. We are a species that measures things, I said. The Voreth representative was quiet for a moment. Yes, they said finally, that is what we are observing. They inclined their head in the manner that Voreth used for closing a private exchange, and moved back toward the chamber doors where the rest of their delegation was waiting. Garland came up beside me. What was that about? He asked. They were paying us a compliment, I said. I think. We walked to the docking bay. The station's corridors were busy with delegations making their way to their own vessels, the end-of-session movement that happened when a large gathering dispersed. I passed representatives from a dozen species, some of whom noticed me and some of whom did not. The ones who noticed showed it in small ways, a slight adjustment of posture, a flicker of attention, a brief pause in whatever conversation they had been having. I did not stop for any of them. I kept walking. At the docking bay entrance, 2 of the Hevari delegation were standing near their gate, talking in low voices. I recognized them from the session. One of them looked at me as I passed. I looked back. We held each other's gaze for approximately 2 seconds. Then I kept walking. In the transit vessel, with Titan's coordinates locked in and the station shrinking behind us, I pulled out the written notes I had made during the session, not the spoken record, which the Covenant kept automatically. My own notes, written in shorthand on a physical pad because electronic documents felt too permanent for thinking in progress. I looked at what I had written. Most of it was questions, not about what had happened, but about what came next. The Covenant membership meant something concrete. It meant consultation rights on any action that affected human space. It meant territorial acknowledgement on the formal record. It meant that the next species that looked at our settlements and saw an inconvenient infestation would have to pass through a legal framework before acting rather than simply acting. It was not protection. I had said we were not asking for protection. That was true, but it was something, a structure, a set of rules that we were now inside rather than outside of, which changed the calculation for anyone considering making us a target. Combined with what we had demonstrated operationally, the calculated delivery of a measured consequence. Combined with the quiet reorientation of 6 civilizations' expansion plans, combined with the Covenant membership, combined with the simple demonstrated fact that humanity had spent 19 months building something extraordinary inside what the galaxy assumed was a defeated civilization, the picture that emerged was one I thought we could build on. Not a picture of dominance, not a picture of aggression seeking new targets, a picture of a species that had looked at an impossible situation and had decided, with full awareness of what it was choosing, to measure the problem and deliver the solution exactly as specified. I wrote one more note on the pad and then closed it. The note said, "The next 19 months begin now." 6 months after Verath 7, I stood on the surface of New Olympia on Mars, not inside a dome. On the surface, in a sealed suit, looking out at the construction around me. The first new dome was 60% complete. Behind it, the framework of a second had gone up in the past 3 weeks, built by crews that worked in full shifts around the Martian clock. The ground under my boots was the same red dust that had always been there, the same that had been there when the first settlers arrived, the same that had blown across empty plains for millions of years before humans ever looked up at a reddish point in the night sky and wondered what it was. It felt different now, not better or worse, different, weighted. The Keth Dominion had paid the first installment of the reparation agreement 40 days ago, not because the Galactic Covenant had ordered them to, though the Covenant had certainly made its position clear. They had paid because the Vorath Collective had spoken privately to the Dominion Council and had said, in the careful, slow language the Vorath always used, that the continued goodwill of the human fleet was worth considerably more than the cost of the agreement, and that the Dominion should think carefully about what it was buying with cooperation versus what it was risking without it. The Dominion had thought carefully. Helen Marsh was leading the technical review of the payment structure. She had taken on the assignment with the same focused energy she had brought to weapons integration, which was to say she had already found 2 discrepancies in the first installment's accounting and had documented both with the kind of thoroughness that made the Keth negotiators visibly uncomfortable. I was glad she was on it. Garland stood beside me on the surface, also suited, looking at the dome framework. He had been with me through every phase of what we were already calling, quietly among ourselves, the response. Not the war, because it had not been a war. Not the operation, because that was too cold a word for something that had cost us so much in the months before it. The response. It was the only word that fit. Caldover is down in the 3rd excavation block, Garland said. He redesigned the foundation anchoring system. Apparently, the original Mars settlement approach had a structural issue in the lower soil strata that nobody had fixed. Of course he did, I said. He is 24 years old. 25, I said. His birthday was last month. Garland looked at me sideways. You kept track. He fixed the power routing on 2 of our ships in 11 days with no engineering degree, I said. I keep track of people like that. We walked toward the construction perimeter. Around us, the site was alive with movement. Workers in suits moving between sections, equipment operating on automated tracks, the slow, steady progress of something being built rather than something being remembered. I had insisted when the reconstruction planning began that the first priority was forward-looking design, not restoration of what had been there before. The settlements that the Keth had dismantled had been good. The new ones would be better. Not as a statement, not as a symbol, but because we had learned things in the 19 months underground, about engineering, about design, about what people needed in a settlement that was going to be a home rather than just a location. We were using all of it. At the edge of the perimeter, a girl was standing with a small group of observers who had come out to see the construction progress. She was perhaps 15, maybe 16, with the look of someone who had grown up somewhere difficult and carried the knowledge of that in the way she held herself. She was watching the dome framework with an expression that was hard to read from a distance, so I walked closer. When I was near enough, she looked at me. She looked at my jacket, at the fleet insignia on it, and then at my face. "Are you the commander?" she said. "I am," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I was 9 when it happened," she said. "I was in the inner dome when the breach alarms went off. My dad carried me to the emergency compartment. We stayed in there for 11 hours. I did not say anything. I let her continue if she wanted to. She wanted to. After that, we were in the Titan refugee facility for about 4 months before they moved us to the underground. The Lazarus thing." She paused. "I did not know what Lazarus was for most of that time. I just knew it was where my dad worked." I looked at her. "What is your father's name?" "Oliver Grant," she said. I stood very still for a moment. "Your father," I said, "ran the calibration check on our primary thruster housing 5 times before he was satisfied. Every single check came back clean. He ran the 5th one because he wanted to be sure." She stared at me. "You remember that?" "He is that kind of person," I said. "Yes, I remember it." She looked back at the dome framework. After a long moment she said, "Why did you stop when you were at Ketha Prime? Why did you stop after 72 hours when you could have kept going?" It was the question that had been asked in many forms since we had returned. Journalists, Covenant observers, Keth analysts, our own people. Everyone wanted to know why we stopped. The answers I had given publicly were accurate, but they were also necessarily formal, about strategic objectives and Covenant relations, and the distinction between consequence and destruction. Here, standing on the red surface of Mars next to the daughter of a man who had run 5 calibration checks because he wanted to be sure, I gave the real answer. "Because stopping when you said you would," I said. is more frightening than not stopping at all. Anyone can lose control. It is easy to lose control when you are angry enough, and we were angry enough. But losing control would have made us into something the galaxy already had a name for and already knew how to deal with. What we did instead, the measuring, the precision, the stopping on the exact hour we said we would stop, that was something they did not have a name for. Something they did not know how to calculate. She was quiet. They were afraid of us before, I said. After Mars, after the outer colonies. They were afraid in the way you are afraid of a storm, something powerful but without direction. After Ketha Prime, they were afraid in a different way. The way you are afraid of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and exactly when to stop. Those are two very different kinds of fear, and only one of them earns you a seat at the table. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "My dad never talks about what it was like in Lazarus." "No," I said, "most of them don't." But they were scared too, right? They were not just working and it was fine. They were scared, I said. Every day, the fear was just quieter than the work. She nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone filing something away for later. I looked back at the dome. Progress was visible even in the time we had been standing there. Or maybe it was just that standing still and watching something be built made the progress more apparent than when you were moving through it. Garland appeared at my shoulder. He had been giving us space without making it obvious that he was giving us space, which was a skill he had developed over 19 months of close quarters. He handed me a data pad. On it was the latest intelligence summary. 6 mid-tier civilizations had modified their expansion projections in the past 30 days. Not officially, not publicly, just quietly redirected routes and resource allocations that had previously been pushing into sectors adjacent to human-claimed space. The collective adjustment in those projections represented trillions of units of economic activity being pointed somewhere else. Nobody had asked them to do this. Nobody had threatened them. They had simply looked at the last 6 months and done the math. I handed the pad back to Garland. The girl had watched the exchange. "Good news or bad news?" she asked. "Neither," I said. "Information. We act on information." She seemed to consider this a reasonable answer. "My dad said you were the one who decided to stop at 72 hours, that it was your call." "It was," I said. "How did you know it was the right number?" I looked at the red dust under my boots, at the framework of the new dome rising against the Martian sky, which was a pale pink at this hour, thin and clear and very far up. "Mars took 11 hours to fall," I said. "Callisto took 9. The outer colony took 14. Total, that is 34 hours of our people inside emergency compartments in the dark, not knowing what was coming next. I multiplied that by 2 and added 4 hours for margin. 72 hours. She stared at me. "That is not," she said slowly, "what I expected you to say." "I know," I said. "Most people expect something strategic, something calculated from military doctrine." I paused. It was calculated, just not from military doctrine. She was quiet for a long time. Around us, the construction continued. Equipment moved, workers communicated in short, clear exchanges. The dome framework extended another meter in the direction of the eastern perimeter. "Are you going to stay on Mars?" she finally asked, "now that it is being rebuilt?" It was a question I had been asked in various forms since the reconstruction planning began. What I always said publicly was that my role was operational, and that Martian governance would be decided by Martian residents through the processes they established for themselves. To Oliver Grant's daughter, standing on the surface her father had once carried her away from in the dark, I said something closer to what I actually thought. "I will stay until it does not need me," I said, "and then I will do whatever comes next." She nodded. She looked at me for one more moment, something moving in her expression that I could not fully name but recognized. The look of someone who is putting a piece of something large into place inside a picture they are still building. Then she said, "Thank you," and walked back toward the observation group. I watched her go. Garland said quietly, "Oliver Grant's daughter." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Small galaxy." I almost said it is getting smaller, but that was not quite right. It was not getting smaller. It was getting more present, more specific, more populated with the kinds of moments that turned events into memories and memories into the reasons people do the things they do. I turned back toward the construction and started walking. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done, and that was not a complaint. It had never been a complaint. It was the thing that had kept 7 ships crewed and 7 crews working, and 19 months of underground labor moving forward when the easier option was always to believe that the easier option was the only one available. We did not believe that. We had never believed that. Somewhere above the thin Martian sky, a galactic Covenant liaison ship sat in orbit, the first official diplomatic vessel to anchor at Mars in the history of both civilizations. They had asked permission before entering the orbital zone. I had noted that. In the months before the response, the Keth blockade had not asked permission for anything. Things had changed. I did not feel triumphant about that. I felt something quieter and more permanent, the feeling that comes not from winning, but from completing something that needed to be completed. From doing the specific thing that the specific moment required and doing it exactly as promised and stopping exactly when you said you would stop. The dome framework caught the afternoon light as I walked toward it. The construction team saw me coming and someone gave a brief acknowledging wave before returning immediately to work. That was exactly right. That was the correct response. Not ceremony, not interruption. Just the nod of recognition between people who are all doing what needs to be done. I reached the perimeter and stepped through the equipment gate into the active construction zone. Dust rose lightly around my boots. The air in my suit recycled steadily. Above me, the framework was close enough now that I could see the individual joints where sections connected, the points where precision mattered most, the places where a measurement off by a fraction would mean something important down the line. It looked good. It looked exactly right. Somewhere in the structure, a man who had run 5 calibration checks because he wanted to be sure was working on a foundation anchoring system that had never been done quite this way before. The galaxy was still silent about what it had witnessed 6 months ago. Not the permanent silence of something ended, but the temporary silence of something being processed, recalculated, carefully reconsidered. Good, let them think. We had a Mars to rebuild. The reconstruction work had a rhythm to it that I found easier to live inside than the rhythm of the months before it. It was still demanding. The physical challenge of building on Mars was not smaller than the challenge of building inside Titan, just different in character. On Titan, we had been hidden, working in artificial light, making decisions that had to account for the possibility of discovery at every stage. On Mars, we were visible, working under a pale sky, making decisions that had to account for the possibility of getting it wrong in ways that would affect people who were going to live here. Both kinds of pressure were real. The Mars pressure was the kind I preferred. Helen Marsh arrived on Mars 3 weeks after I did. She had finished the first cycle of the Keth reparation audit and had handed it to the secondary review team with documentation so thorough that the team lead told me privately it would take them a month just to understand what Helen had done, let alone verify it. Helen had then, without being asked, moved on to the technical specifications for the new settlement power grid, because she had reviewed the original plans and found 7 places where the efficiency could be improved. I gave her the assignment officially and let her get to work. Cal Dover, whose full name was Callum but who had been Cal since before anyone at Lazarus could remember, was on site most days. He had taken on the foundation work as his primary project and approached it with the same obsessive care he brought to everything. I stopped by the excavation block where he was working on a Tuesday afternoon, the Martian sun at a low angle that turned the dust copper-colored, and found him crouched over a soil analysis display with 2 engineers who were, by their expressions, slightly overwhelmed by the pace at which Cal was generating conclusions from the data. He looked up when I arrived. "The lower strata here has a crystalline structure that the original survey missed," he said by way of greeting. "It means we need to go deeper on the anchor points in this quadrant, not by a lot, about 4 meters more, but if we do not, we get micro-movement in the dome base during the temperature cycles." 4 meters, I said. 4 meters, he confirmed. "I know it adds time." "Add it," I said. "You were right about the power routing. I will assume you are right about this." He nodded and went back to the display. The two engineers exchanged a look that suggested they had been hoping I would push back and save them from having to dig 4 more meters, but they picked up their tools without complaint. I walked back to the site perimeter and stood for a moment watching the construction. The dome framework was at 80% now. In another 3 weeks it would be sealed. In another 3 months it would be pressurized and the first residents would move in. Real residents, not construction workers, not project staff. People who had been in refugee facilities for 6 months or longer, waiting for a place to come back to. I had met a few of them in the transit hub where the reconstruction teams rotated. They were patient in the way people are patient when patience is the only option available to them, and they were watchful, following the project updates with the attention of people whose entire futures were tied to whether a dome was ready on time. I had told each of them that we were on schedule. I had meant it each time. Leon Price came to Mars for 2 weeks in the 4th month of reconstruction. He had been handling the fleet repositioning since our return, the work of determining where 7 ships should be stationed now that their original purpose had been fulfilled, and a new strategic posture needed to be established. It was detail-heavy work, requiring coordination with the Covenant's new Human Liaison Office, which itself was still being organized and staffed, and requiring decisions about which systems could benefit from a human presence and which were better served by restraint. Leon sat with me one evening on the outer platform of the temporary administrative building, which was the highest external point in the construction zone, and offered a view of the site that was genuinely impressive if you had spent enough time underground to appreciate open space. The sky was darkening toward the deep Martian night, and the construction lights were coming on across the site, and the two of us sat in sealed suits and watched it happen. "The Covenant Liaison Office asked me today about permanent fleet positioning," Leon said. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I would ask the commander." I looked at him. "I am not technically the commander of anything right now." "You are the person whose opinion I am going to act on," he said. "So functionally the distinction does not matter." This was an accurate description of how things worked in our particular group and had been since before Lazarus was completed. I did not argue with it. "The fleet stays distributed," I said. "No concentration that reads as aggressive posture, but no withdrawal that reads as retreat. Leon is good at that kind of geometry. Leon should decide." He was quiet for a moment. "That is not really an answer." "Yes, it is," I said. "I just put your name in it." He almost laughed. Almost. Leon Price did not quite laugh at things as a matter of personal habit, but he came close sometimes, and I had learned to count those near laughs as a meaningful indicator of his actual assessment of a situation. "The HFY Federation sent a trade inquiry to the Covenant Liaison Office," he said after a while. I turned to look at him. "A trade inquiry." "For mineral exchange in the belt-adjacent sectors," he said, "through proper channels, formally addressed. The word please appears in it 3 times. The HFY Federation, whose scientists had published an academic paper about primitive human resistance response, was formally asking to trade with us, and using the word please 3 times in the request." "What is the Covenant Liaison's recommendation?" I asked. "They recommend we accept," Leon said. "With standard terms, nothing special." "Then we accept," I said, "with standard terms." He nodded. We sat in silence for a while. Below us, the construction lights made the site look almost like it was alive, which it was, in the way that any place full of working people is alive. "Do you think it is going to hold?" Leon asked. The way they are treating us now, the care, the channel messages with pleas in them, the quiet rerouting of expansion plans. It was the question that did not have a comfortable answer. I could say yes, and it would be optimistic in a way that felt dishonest. I could say no, and it would be pessimistic in a way that felt like a different kind of dishonesty. Neither quite fit what I actually thought. I think the galaxy learned something it cannot unlearn, I said. Not about our weapons, not about our ships, about our approach to problems. The fact that we measured the response. The fact that we stopped on time. The fact that we sent a civilian reassurance message in the middle of an operation. Those things cannot be erased from the record, and that record changes the calculation for anyone looking at us and deciding how to act. But calculations change again, Leon said. Yes, I said. They do, which is why we keep building. Not weapons, necessarily. People like Cal Dover and Helen Marsh and Oliver Grant. The capacity to keep solving impossible problems is harder to threaten than any specific weapon system. If the galaxy sees us as a civilization that produces people who run 5 calibration checks because they want to be sure, who redesign foundation anchors 4 meters deeper because the soil data says they should, who build translation matrices from intercepted signals in 19 months of underground work, that is a more durable protection than anything we could park in orbit. Leon looked at me for a long moment. You have been thinking about this. I have been thinking about everything, I said. It is what the first 6 months of not being underground is for. He almost laughed again, closer this time. At the end of his 2 weeks, Leon returned to the fleet. He shook my hand before he boarded, which was unusual for him. I shook back without making it significant. Dorothy Shaw arrived on Mars in the 5th month. She had been working with the Covenant's new Communication Standards Office to establish human-readable protocols for the 17 most common alien languages, which was essentially building an expanded version of what she had done for the operation, but for ongoing civilian use rather than a single military engagement. She brought 3 members of her team with her to see the construction, because she had described Mars to them often enough that they had asked to come. I showed them the site personally, not as a tour, not with ceremony, just walking them through the sections that were progressing and explaining what each part was meant to do. Dorothy's team were curious in the specific way that people who work with language are curious, wanting to understand the logic behind each decision, the why that connected each choice to the outcome it was supposed to produce. One of them, a young man named Peter Cole who was not related to Warren, asked me what the single most important decision of the operation had been. Not the largest or the most dramatic, the most important. I thought about it seriously. I had been asked versions of this question before, and had given various answers depending on what the questioner seemed to actually be trying to understand. To Peter Cole, who worked with language and logic and the precise communication of meaning, I gave the answer that was most precisely true. Correcting the drift on the 2 disabled Keth vessels, I said, at the 58th hour, when Claire Dunstan asked if we should fix their orbit and I said yes. He frowned slightly. Why that one? Because it was not in the plan, I said. The plan covered the operation. The plan did not cover what we would do when an opportunity arose to either act with minimal care or act with complete care, and the only one watching was ourselves and our own record. We acted with complete care. That choice, made when there was no external pressure to make it, told us who we were more accurately than any other single moment. He was quiet for a moment, processing that. The galaxy would not have known if you had not corrected it, he said. We would have known, I said. Dorothy was looking at me with an expression that I recognized as the one she had worn after I sent the civilian reassurance message during the operation. The expression of someone filing something very carefully into a mental category that did not have a label yet. I left them to continue their tour with one of the site coordinators and went back to the administrative platform. Garland was there with the daily update packet, which had grown progressively more ordinary over the past 5 months, which was exactly what I wanted to see. ordinary problems, construction timeline problems, supply logistics problems, staffing rotation problems. The entirely mundane challenges of building something real in a place where the air was thin, and the temperature swings were significant, and the dust got into everything. I read through it. I made 3 decisions, annotated 2 items for follow-up, and sent a question to Cal Dover about the Quadrant 7 foundation schedule. Cal responded in 4 minutes with a full breakdown, 3 diagrams, and a note at the end that said ahead of revised schedule by 2 days. 2 days ahead. I put the tablet down and looked out at the construction. The dome framework was fully sealed now in the eastern section. 3 more weeks and the whole thing would be pressurized, and the light inside would change, would look different, warmer, more like something that was meant to be lived in rather than worked in. I had a meeting in the afternoon with the first group of permanent residents who were being processed for the initial move-in, 12 families, adults and children, people who had been in refugee facilities since before Lazarus launched. I had asked to meet them, not as a formal thing, not as an event with any ceremony attached to it. I wanted to know who was going to live here. I wanted to know their names. The meeting was in a temporary common room that the construction team used for their breaks. It smelled like recycled air and dust sealer, and something someone had been cooking on a portable unit in the corner. 12 families arranged themselves in the chairs and along the walls, and we introduced ourselves. And I listened, while each of them said their name and where they had been before, and what had brought them to the point of being in this room on this afternoon. None of them were dramatic about it. None of them performed their grief or their resilience. They were just people who had a specific history and were now in the specific present of this room, on this recovering world, talking to a person in a fleet jacket who had asked to know their names. One couple had a daughter who was about 7. She had been born in the refugee facility. She had never lived anywhere that was not temporary. Her parents had given her a Martian name, Arya, which they explained was from an old Earth musical form, but also sounded like the kind of name a person born on Mars should have. Arya sat in her mother's lap and looked at everything with the specific alertness of a child who has learned that new environments contain important information and should be observed carefully before engaging. I asked her what she was most looking forward to about living in the dome. She thought about it with genuine seriousness. Then she said, "My dad said I can have a garden." Her father confirmed this with a nod. "There is a section of the lower residential level designed for personal cultivation," he said. "Small plots. We signed up for one." I looked at Arya, a 7-year-old born in a refugee facility who had been promised a garden. Not a metaphorical garden, not a symbolic one. A real plot of soil, processed and enriched and sealed under a dome that had been anchored 4 meters deeper than the original plan specified because a 25-year-old from a transit hub had checked the soil strata and done the math. "Your garden is going to be in good soil," I said. She considered this information and apparently found it satisfactory. I stayed for 2 hours. I learned all 12 families' names. I did not write them down. I did not need to. They were the kind of names that stay with you without effort because they belong to the kind of moment that does not leave. When the meeting ended and people began dispersing back to their quarters in the temporary residential section, Garland fell into step beside me in the corridor. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. The same question he had asked me the night before we launched from Titan. "Different," I said. "Better or worse than before?" I thought about the answer. Before, the feeling was purpose, clear, forward-facing, aimed at something specific. Now the feeling is something that does not have the same kind of direction. It is more like being in the middle of something rather than at the edge of something. Is that good? It is real, I said. I think that is better than good. We walked out onto the outer platform. The site was in the late afternoon work period, the time when people were moving between tasks, and the pace had a different quality than the morning surge. Above the dome framework, the Martian sky was the pale copper pink that came in the hours before sunset. To the east, visible as a faint point if you knew where to look, the Covenant liaison ship maintained its orbit. Garland stood beside me. We looked at the sky for a moment. "The second group of families starts processing next week," he said. "I know," I said, 47 families. That will fill the eastern residential section to capacity." "Yes," I said. "Cal is already working on the timeline for the second dome." Garland was quiet. Then, "It is going to take years to fill this back up to what it was." "Longer," I said. "We are not rebuilding what it was. We are building what it should have been." He absorbed that. Somewhere below us in the excavation block, Cal Dover was probably still in the soil strata data, finding one more thing to measure, one more point to get exactly right before moving forward. Helen Marsh was probably in the power grid specifications, finding one more efficiency, one more margin that could be improved. Oliver Grant was probably checking something for the 5th time because he wanted to be sure. The construction lights came on as the sun dropped lower. The site was lit in a warm, artificial glow that made the dome framework look like something that had always been there, or at least something that was supposed to be there, the scaffold of a future that was still in the process of being built. The galaxy was out there, still watching, not in the open, obvious way it had watched when our colonies burned. Quietly, carefully, from behind the respectful distance of a community that had adjusted its understanding of who we were and what we were capable of. 6 civilizations with modified expansion plans, 34 votes in a Covenant session, a Keth Dominion paying reparations because the math of the alternative was too clear to ignore, a Hevari trade inquiry with 3 uses of the word please. And here, on the surface of Mars, a 7-year-old named Arya who had been promised a garden. I pressed one hand briefly against the railing of the platform, the metal cool through my glove, solid and real. The galaxy was still silent about what it had witnessed, processing, recalculating, learning some of them the right lesson. Let them think as long as they needed. We had a Mars to finish.